A spooky place.
Have you ever felt the pull of the ocean, that eerie whisper in the waves calling you closer, even when no one else hears it? Some say the sea never truly lets go of those it claims, and after tonight, neither will your dreams. You won't be getting a good sleep tonight. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Siren's Kiss. The traveler arrived at the seaside, and just as the storm rolled in, thunder rumbling over the waves like some great unseen beast, the building stood alone on the edge of a jagged cliff, its windows flickering with weak candlelight. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat, and was greeted by the innkeeper, a gaunt man with hollow eyes. The traveler asked for a room, and after a long pause, the innkeeper handed him a rusted key. "No one stays twice," the man muttered, barely above a whisper. Ignoring the cryptic warning, the traveler climbed the creaking stairs and entered his room. It smelled of salt and old wood, the air damp as if the sea itself had seeped through the walls. Exhausted, he sat on the bed, running a hand through his wet hair. Then he saw her. She stood by the window, her pale skin illuminated by the flickering lantern light. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders in dark waves, but it was her eyes that held him captive, two shifting pools of deep blue, like the endless ocean. She smiled, and her voice was the sound of distant waves as she whispered, "You look tired. Let me hold you." He could not resist. The moment her hands touched him, his thoughts grew heavy, his body sinking into her embrace. The night blurred into whispers and dreams, a lullaby of rushing tides and whispered promises. But as dawn crept over the horizon, something changed. He woke with a gasp, but he could not move. His limbs felt weighted, his body sinking deeper into the mattress as if it had turned to water. The woman lay beside him, her hand resting lightly on his chest, her lips curved into a knowing smile. "You are mine now," she murmured, just as the darkness swallowed him whole. The traveler woke again, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat, or was it seawater? He bolted upright and scanned the room. The candle had burned out, but something was wrong. The walls were damp, and a faint scent of salt water clung to the air. Staggering downstairs, he found the innkeeper waiting for him, his sunken eyes filled with something like pity. "You're lucky to wake up at all," the old man said. "The others never do." Confused, the traveler demanded answers, but the innkeeper only sighed. He spoke of the room's history, of guests who stayed, only to vanish by morning. The room had been vacant for decades, and yet, somehow, it never stayed empty for long. The traveler tried to leave. He grabbed his bag, stepped out the door, and into the cold morning air. But as soon as his boots touched the wet earth, he found himself back inside, standing at the entrance once more. His breath hitched. He turned and tried again, and again. Every time, he stepped forward, only to find himself back inside the inn, trapped within its walls. That night, the storm raged louder than before. As the traveler lay in bed, trying to keep his eyes open, he heard the soft whisper of the waves. He turned, and there she was again, her oceanic gaze pulling him under like a riptide. "You cannot leave," she said, brushing cold fingers against his cheek. "Not yet." Determined to break free, the traveler began searching the inn for clues. Dusty journals, brittle with age, lined the bookshelves in the sitting room. He flipped through them and found scattered entries, frantic scribbles from past guests, all describing the same woman, the same eyes, the same sinking paralysis. One entry stood out. It spoke of a shipwreck just off the coast, long ago. A woman had drowned, her body never recovered. Some said she returned with the tide, her spirit bound to the land, searching for company in her endless solitude. A sudden gust of wind sent a candle flickering, casting long shadows along the walls. The traveler followed the draft to a hidden trapdoor beneath the stairs. It groaned as he pried it open, revealing a dark passageway leading below. The scent of seawater thickened as he descended. The air grew colder, dampness clinging to his skin. At the bottom of the passage, he found a waterlogged chamber, its walls lined with rotting wood, its floor covered in murky puddles. And then he saw them. Bones. Dozens of them. Some half buried in the mud, others piled in the corners, their skulls grinning in silent torment. The traveler stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the moment he turned to flee, the water began to rise. A voice, achingly familiar, whispered in his ear, "You were here before." He woke with a start, the storm still raging outside. The room was the same. The walls, the window, the flickering lantern light. And standing by the window, waiting for him, was her. His heart pounded. No, he had escaped. He had seen the truth. He had uncovered the past. This wasn't real. "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "You look afraid." He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The weight of the tide pressed against him once more. He had been here before. The cycle was unbroken. No one ever left. No one ever stayed twice, because they never truly left at all. As she approached, her eyes deep as the abyss, he felt himself slipping once more, drowning in the endless tide. And outside, the storm raged on. The traveler fought against the pull of the tide, his mind screaming for him to wake up, to move, to do anything but sink into her embrace again. But his body had already begun to betray him. His limbs grew heavy, his breath shallow, and his thoughts blurred like ripples on the water's surface. "It's easier if you let go," she murmured, her voice soothing, hypnotic. "No, not this time." Summoning every ounce of strength left, he wrenched himself from the bed and stumbled toward the door. His fingers fumbled with the handle. It was locked. He turned, his pulse hammering. The woman stood mere inches from him now, watching him with something that almost looked like sorrow. "Why do you fight?" she whispered. The traveler's breath hitched. Because he had to. Because he wasn't ready to become just another name in those forgotten journals. Desperate, he lunged for the window, but the moment his hands touched the glass, it shifted beneath his fingers. No longer solid, the surface rippled like the ocean, pulling him in. He struggled, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. Cold water surged into his lungs as darkness swallowed him whole. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of voices, murmuring, whispering. His eyes shot open, and he found himself floating beneath the waves. The sea stretched infinitely around him, filled with drifting figures. Their faces were eerily familiar. Men and women, their expressions frozen in despair. The lost guests, the ones who never left. They reached for him, their mouths opening as if to warn him, but no words came. Only the muted sound of the tide pulling them deeper into the abyss. And then, through the gloom, he saw her. She was no longer just a woman. Beneath the water, her form had changed, her limbs elongated, her hair floating like tendrils of ink, her once beautiful face shifting, inhuman. And her eyes, those endless, drowning eyes, pierced through him, pulling him further into her grasp. "You belong to the sea now." The traveler sank deeper, the weight of the ocean crushing his lungs. Memories flickered through his mind. His journey, the inn, the warnings he had ignored. The lost ones had tried to speak, to warn him, but now it was too late. He was becoming one of them. No! Somewhere, beyond the water, beyond the whispers, something called to him. A choice. He felt it in his bones. The cycle was not unbreakable. There had to be a way. With a final, desperate surge of will, he reached out, not toward her, not toward the others, but toward the surface. His fingers clawed at the water, his body screaming for air. She hissed, her grip tightening around his wrist. "Don't fight it. You're already mine." He locked eyes with her. For the first time, he saw what lay behind those oceanic depths. Not just hunger, but loneliness. A longing that had lasted centuries, trapping her as much as it had trapped him. "Let me go," he pleaded. "You don't have to do this." For a moment, the tide wavered. Her grip loosened. The whispering voices around them stilled. And then, a force pulled him upward, tearing him away from her grasp. Water churned around him as he broke the surface, gasping, coughing, his body crashing onto the shore. The storm had passed. The inn stood silent in the distance, its windows dark. The door was gone, as if it had never existed. Shaking, he turned to the ocean. The waves were calm now, lapping gently at the shore. And beneath them, far below, he swore he could see those same blue eyes watching him one last time before vanishing into the deep. The traveler staggered to his feet. He did not look back. He would never return, because no one stayed twice, and no one ever escaped twice either. Days passed, but the traveler couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Even after putting miles between himself and that cursed inn, he still woke in the middle of the night gasping for breath, his body drenched in cold sweat. Or was it seawater? He tried to convince himself it was just the trauma, the lingering fear of what he had barely escaped. But then he saw the mark. It was faint at first, a bruise-like stain on his wrist, exactly where she had held him. But as the days turned to weeks, it darkened, twisting into something more like ink, spreading beneath his skin like veins filled with ocean water. At night, he swore he could hear the sound of waves crashing, even when he was far inland. And worse, he was beginning to hear her voice. "Come back." It was never loud, just a whisper on the wind, a gentle pull in the back of his mind. He ignored it. He had escaped. He would not return. But the mark had other plans. One evening, as he walked along the docks of a distant town, he caught his reflection in the water. His breath hitched. His eyes, just for a moment, weren't his own. They were shifting, deep blue, like the endless sea. A wave of cold washed over him. The mark burned, and then, from beneath the water, he saw something moving. Long, pale fingers breaking the surface. She was calling him back. The traveler fought against the pull, but the tide inside him grew stronger each day. No matter how far he ran, the ocean called to him. It whispered through the rain, crashed through his dreams, and lapped at his mind like an unrelenting tide. And then, on the night of the final storm, he knew he had lost. The sky blackened as thunder rumbled overhead. Rain lashed against his skin, but it wasn't cold. It felt like the sea reaching for him, reclaiming what was hers. The mark on his wrist pulsed, spreading up his arm, and his vision blurred. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the waves. Somewhere closer, she whispered, "You were never meant to leave." He stumbled forward, his feet moving on their own. The wind howled, the storm surged, and yet the path before him was clear. The ocean awaited him, its dark surface reflecting flashes of lightning. He reached the shore, his body trembling, his breath uneven. He could still fight. He could still resist. And then he saw her. She stood in the water, her hair floating around her like seaweed, her eyes shimmering with something almost tender. She did not drag him forward. She did not force him under. She only waited. "You are mine," she said. The traveler exhaled slowly and stepped into the sea, cold arms wrapped around him. The water closed over his head, and the storm carried him home. The town woke to a still morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with salt and the scent of rain-soaked earth. Fishermen trudged to the shore, their boots sinking into the damp sand, their voices hushed. The sea was always cruel after a storm. It took more than it gave. Then they saw him. A man stood ankle deep in the water, his clothes drenched, his skin pale as if the tide had wrung the life from him. His hair clung to his forehead in wet strands, and when he lifted his head, his eyes, those deep, shifting blue eyes, reflected the ocean behind him. The fisherman hesitated. "Sir?" One called, but the man didn't respond. He only took a step forward, the water rolling off him in thick, heavy rivulets. His movements were sluggish, unnatural, as though he had been beneath the waves for too long. Someone gasped. The bruised stain on his wrist had spread, twisting up his arm like black veins. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only a whisper, barely audible over the lapping tide. "She's waiting." Then, without another sound, he turned and walked toward town. The sea had taken him, and now it had sent him back. He did not remember returning. The streets of the town were foreign to him, yet his feet knew where to go. The people whispered, their gazes flickering toward him before quickly turning away. He could hear their murmurs. They spoke of shipwrecks, of lost souls who returned but were never the same. The traveler, if he could still call himself that, felt the ocean inside him, rising and falling with every breath. His skin was cold, his heartbeat sluggish, as if he were still floating beneath the waves. He stopped before a shop window, catching his reflection in the glass. His face was gaunt, his lips slightly parted as though gasping for air. But it was his eyes that made him stagger back. They were no longer his own. The shifting blues, the endless depths, he had seen them before. In her. "No one stays twice," the innkeeper had said. Perhaps that was true, because this time he was not just a guest. He was the invitation. The realization struck like a wave crashing against the rocks. He was no longer running from her. He was her, a vessel for the tide, a voice for the storm. And somewhere, miles away, another traveler was seeking shelter for the night. The storm would come again, and he would be waiting. The traveler. No, the drowned man. No, the vessel. Sat in the corner of the seaside tavern, silent as the waves beyond the shore. No one spoke to him. No one dared. But they watched him, their gazes flickering like candlelight, their whispers like the hush of the tide. And then, on the third night, a stranger arrived. He was weary, soaked from the rain, his boots caked with mud from the road. He carried the same exhaustion the traveler once had, the same naive relief at finding shelter before the storm. The drowned man lifted his gaze, feeling something shift within him. The ocean stirred, the storm within whispered. The stranger approached the bar, ordered a drink, glanced at the drowned man, then quickly looked away. But it was already too late. The drowned man did not need to speak. His presence was enough. The whisper of the tide had already reached the stranger's ears, and soon he would seek the inn. The cycle had begun again. The stranger did not remember how he got there. One moment, he was sitting in the tavern, listening to the wind rattle the windows. The next, he was standing before a familiar building, a lonely inn perched at the cliff's edge, its windows dark, its doors slightly ajar. Had he planned to come here? He wasn't sure, but it felt right. The air smelled of salt, damp and heavy. A single lantern flickered inside. He stepped through the threshold, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. No one greeted him, but a key waited on the counter, rusted and cold. As his fingers closed around it, a shiver ran down his spine. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open. The stranger entered the room, and the moment he did, he knew something was wrong. The air was thick, the scent of seawater clinging to the walls. The bed, though empty, seemed almost sunken, as though something had been lying there moments before. And then he saw her. She stood by the window, the moonlight outlining her delicate frame. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like waves rolling onto the shore. "You look tired," she whispered, turning to face him. Her eyes were the color of the ocean, deep, endless, drowning. The stranger's breath hitched. He had never seen her before, and yet he knew her. She smiled, stepping closer, her fingers tracing along his arm. "Let me hold you." The room tilted, his vision blurred. He sank into her arms, and the tide pulled him under. The innkeeper sat alone in the darkness, watching the storm rage beyond the cliffs. He had stopped trying to warn them. It never mattered. The tide always called to the weary, the lost, the restless souls who sought shelter from the storm. Somewhere upstairs, the whispers had already begun. Soft, gentle, deceptive. The same story, repeating, the same fate unraveling. He had seen it before. He would see it again. And when the morning came, the room would be empty once more. The drowned man would return to town, and the sea would be waiting for its next traveler. Miles away, a traveler walked the road alone, the scent of rain heavy in the air. He had been walking for days, weary and aching, longing for a warm bed and a place to rest. Ahead, the sky darkened. A storm was coming, and in the distance, perched on the cliffs, an inn's lantern flickered like a beacon in the night. He smiled in relief. He never saw the figure watching from the shore. He never heard the tide whisper his name. And as he stepped toward the light, the waves crashed against the rocks below, welcoming him home. The traveler stepped through the door, shaking the rain from his coat. The inn was quiet, save for the soft crackling of a fire in the hearth. A warmth settled over him, soothing his aching limbs. The counter was empty, but a tarnished key rested on the worn wood, as though waiting just for him. He hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. A guest book lay open beside the key, its pages yellowed with age. His fingers brushed the spine, and an icy shiver crawled up his neck. Names filled the pages, written in neat, looping script, but there were no checkout dates. His breath quickened. He turned the page. The ink on the last entry was still wet. His own name. A floorboard creaked behind him. The traveler's hands trembled as he backed away from the counter. He needed to leave. Now! But when he turned toward the door, it was gone. Only a blank wall remained, as though the entrance had never been there. His pulse thundered in his ears. Another creak, this time from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. A shadow stretched along the stairway as someone, or something, descended. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure stepped into the dim light. A man, soaking wet. His clothes clung to his frame, water dripping onto the wooden floor. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted as though struggling for breath. And his eyes, those deep, shifting blue eyes. The traveler gasped, because he had seen those eyes before. In his own reflection, the traveler awoke to the scent of salt and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. He sat up abruptly, his breath ragged. Had it been a dream? The room was unfamiliar. The walls damp, the air thick with moisture. A faint hum of whispers drifted from the hallway. He staggered to the window. The sea stretched endlessly before him, dark and hungry. His own reflection in the glass made his stomach turn. His face looked the same almost, but his eyes, the color was fading. A knock echoed through the room. Slow, hollow. The traveler swallowed hard, stepping toward the door. His hand hesitated over the handle. Somewhere deep inside, he knew if he opened it, he would never leave again. But his fingers curled around the knob anyway, and he turned it. The storm raged outside, yet the inn remained untouched. Warm, silent, waiting. A group of fishermen huddled in the tavern down the road, their faces pale, their drinks untouched. Another one of them muttered, "Saw him walking 2 nights ago." They all knew what that meant. The inn took who it wanted, and those who stayed never left. A younger fisherman, new to town, frowned. "What are you talking about?" The eldest among them exhaled slowly, staring into his untouched ale. "That inn by the cliffs," he said. "It's been empty for decades. No one runs it. No one should be in there." The young fisherman scoffed. "That's ridiculous. If someone's staying there, I'll go check." The old man's gaze lifted, heavy with sorrow. "You don't knock on a door that's already open," he said. The wind howled outside. The tide rolled in, and no one said another word. Morning came. The storm had passed. The fishermen, reluctant yet resigned, made their way toward the cliffs. As always, the inn stood untouched. No sign of the traveler, no footprints in the wet sand. Only the waves greeted them, their rhythm slow and steady, as though satisfied. One of the men dared to step inside. Empty, except for the guest book. The last entry was still there, ink faded but legible, a name they had never heard before, and beside it, a single, wet handprint. The sea had taken another, and soon it would take more, because the tide never forgets, and neither does she. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.